So I'm going to show you something that should settle the argument regarding these vaxes. There's a whole bunch of studies on the effect of vaccines, all collated and linked in the description. Let's get away from things that are subjective to reporting and coding and just look at deaths, the only reliable, objective outcome measure. So here we see the effectiveness of vaccinations across 70 studies. There's a site link that collates these. Every paper is linked out. It's totally transparent. So all this talk about vaccine trial data not being transparent is completely bogus. Here, right in front of you, no more of this talk about the data not being transparent. What about the efficacy of ivermectin? Was it used to treat other viral infections? Yes. Again, bypassing all of the games regarding what gets reported as COVID and how it's counted. And frankly, that is a fair point. Reporting standards are heterogeneous. You can't compare country to country, to some degree not even state to state. So let's just look at what you can expect in terms of mortality when you take ivermectin. So this is a paper, again, linked in the description, that looked at exactly that, mortality and ivermectin usage. And as you can see, over the time window which they looked at, there was some benefit for the very old. But you can see its benefits begin to wear off over time. It's a band-aid solution. There's also the possibility that sustained use of ivermectin could lead to greater mortality. Just looking at these charts here. What happens at the endpoints here? And again, we're just looking at deaths, so no games about this or that being reported as whatever, just looking at mortality. There's a possibility that greater use of ivermectin over this time span will actually lead to a higher death rate or higher mortality once you start going past the time span of this chart. So there we go. Immediate, massive benefits from the vaccines on the issue of mortality. The researchers who have dedicated their lives to this stuff know what they're doing, and they're doing a bang-up job with this vaccine. There, I just said it. You can find stories about people having reactions, and no doubt that happens. And VAERS is more well known now than it has ever been. So comparing the VAERS reports today to VAERS report in the past, that's not an apples to apples comparison. For whom it may concern, even Donald Trump himself endorses this. Wait a minute, hold on. Oh, dang it, I'm such an idiot. I got this backwards here. Okay, these were the results for ivermectin administration, and these were results for the jab, both looking at mortality. Okay. I knew it seemed too good to be true that the Pfizer mystery juice would be this super effective, would be as effective as an old repurposed drug. Could you imagine if what I said here was true, if these mRNA injections had anything approaching the level of proven efficacy of ivermectin? You would have heard about it long before getting to this video. No, that's the efficacy of ivermectin on COVID people. Okay, the horse dewormer. I mean, yeah, it's used as a horse dewormer and it works. So what? What other drugs are used on animals and humans? Oh, here's a drug. Here's some aspirin. Is aspirin given to animals from time to time? Probably. But this is just deranged. As in, the FDA is deranged in saying this and pushing the narrative that ivermectin doesn't work against the COVID and that it's like a horse dewormer. This is something that is, you talk about misinformation. Like, this is actual misinformation, and it's coming from the organizations that are, one, most capable of pushing misinformation, right? Certainly, the FDA has more power and ability to push true misinformation than, anyone else on this matter. One, and two, they have more of a financial incentive to push this kind of misinformation than just about anyone else, except for like Pfizer themselves. So, a question here, authorities. Does anything man on internet say have any impact on what you believe? Is there any way for me to be correct about this? About just what I've said here? And for, big logo, big building, sort of busy work addled corporate adults with degrees in something that is considered relevant to what they're doing, and maybe sometimes it even is it possible for those people to be wrong? Or is that just not allowed in your frame of reference? Let's apply this thinking to two things that have more objective measures. PC building and college football. Do you get a pre-made PC from Dell, or do you listen to man on internet who shows you a bunch of specs and performance, shows himself running the PC, does benchmark comparisons, along with maybe a few subjective real-world comparisons as well? Now, for PC building, it's a lot easier. There's much more objectivity in PC performance than in the performance of this injection. I say injection, not vaccine, because a vaccine is something that vaccinates. To be a vaccine, it must vaccinate against something, okay? And that has not been shown for the mRNA injections, okay? A vaccine could just be like playing in mud, and you're going to be vaccinated against something that's in the mud that you're playing in. Or ingesting the scab from a leper. Okay, that's a form of vaccination. Okay, vaccination is not defined by a needle. It's not defined by a form factor, but by a function. So calling these injections vaccines, okay, that's begging the question. That's assuming the very thing you should be trying to prove, that they are in fact vaccinations. Okay, just because it's a needle and it's an injection and it's injected by people that you tag as nurses, okay, it does not make it so. So imagine using this authoritarian reasoning for building PCs, where you didn't have access to the specs. You don't have access to trial data, or if you do, they're behind journals and they're written in academies. You can't really understand it. You rely on interpreters to tell you what it means, right? Which is basically the case with like academic research. So instead of PCs being a personal choice, you had government-mandated PC production for everyone. So do you go with Dell, or do you go with man on internet says things? You could say Dell's been doing this for blue years, and they have professionals with degrees in whippity-woo who have dedicated their lives to building PCs, right? You can say those lines. Say PCs are very important. We can't leave this to randos, or just let anybody look at the specs and pick what they want, right? All the bluster and bullshit, which is revealed because we have benchmarks for PCs. Why do schools overpay for crappy computers? All right, so you want sort of the process by like schools pay for get horrible deals on computers for the schools. You want that same process to be for the vaccines, quote unquote. Okay, why does this big authority government nexus jab seem to not work at all? Why does it seem to not work at all? An analogy that maybe few of you will appreciate would be college football. UCF won't beat Florida. Florida's been around forever. UCF is some upstart commuter school. Look at the recruiting stars. Look at those stars. Wow, all the stars. 4 stars, 5 stars. Jesus, all the stars. They're all the stars. They pay their coach blibbity blue dollars, while UCF only pays their coach bloobity blee dollars, right? So someone saying Florida's better than UCF would be referencing all sorts of not actually football things. They'd be referencing recruiting rankings, the coaching staff, past accomplishments. Now, in that sense, there's a little bit of an advantage in that, a little better than this, because being a relatively simple sport, winning and losing is pretty straightforward. So you can say, oh, Florida did in fact have past accomplishments, right? It is objectively true. You could say title year, right? Whereas the idea that Pfizer's product have on the whole been on net beneficial throughout Pfizer's whole history, or whoever, Johnson & Johnson's history, that's a much more subjective thing, and it involves studies that have ranges, estimates, confounders, okay, all sorts of problems with the approval process, financial incentive to lie, not some third-party authority to say if it's right. There's not actually a third-party authority on any of these things, because the FDA gets about 45% of their budget from these companies. So there's no referee, right? In college football, you have referees, and even they are they're burned a lot. They're needled a lot for impartiality. Okay, but you don't have the kind of third-party objectivity in review of drugs that you do in college football, right? And so college football, you end up having much more reliable performance figures than you do in something that most people would consider to be infinitely more important. Now, you could respond to this and go, are you really comparing a computer company to the scientific medical establishment? Are you really comparing these things? Yes, 1,000 times yes. This is precisely the point. You hold establishments in high esteem when they don't have the kinds of objective metrics like the outcome of football games or PC performance benchmarks. It's completely circular to say this. Say, what? I don't hold Dell in high esteem. Why are you comparing them to a thing which I do hold in high esteem? Because Dell actually faces the razor of objective judgment, revealing just what the fruits of all of their experience and technical expertise actually are. In contrast, the establishments you retain faith in face no such razor, which begs the possibility maybe the reason you retain such faith in one kind of establishment is not another is because one establishment has to actually face some sort of objective criteria, be it a benchmark or the result of a game. In medicine, it's much more muddled, and so you can retain faith much better, right? It's muddled. It's in terms of actual results, right? Results vary depending on sample size and all sorts of things, and who's being given the drug and what doses, and exactly what condition is this supposed to treat, and beyond that, everything's put behind all these journals, which one may have literal paywalls, and two, even if you get it, it's difficult to read because it's written in academies, okay? And three, it's hard to track down all of these papers, right? There's something like 2.6 million peer-reviewed papers published every year, so how the heck are you going to find it? So no, it's not the same, right? PC building is a much more objective thing, right? We have a much clearer understanding of Dell's authority. And the idea that Dell is better at this task than man on internet would reference the same kind of institutional sort of authority cues, like, oh, we got all these guys with all these credentials, they've been doing this for X long, they have their own fabs, right? Whereas man on internet building his own computer doesn't have any of these things, right? Do you see the, right? And yet we know, right, when the rubber hits the road, man on internet tends to do better. So censorship. Right there in YouTube's terms of service, they say, don't show the benchmarks for ivermectin or the jab. Showing benchmarks is misinformation. No benchmarking allowed because Pfizer, have assured us that their proprietary hardware that is under trade secret protection for 50 years or so, or however long it is, go look it up, that's true, and for which they have immunity for anything going wrong, right? And that's true, and is effectively mandatory for a good chunk of the population, will save lives, even though it is not saving lives. This gets into a problem of unbelievability. It's almost like if I was saying something more narrow, that you would be more likely to believe it. Like if I was narrowly critiquing one step of a review process, that you'd be more likely to believe it. Because what I'm saying here about this thing, it sounds so stupid that it's hard to believe, and I think that may be why they're able to get away with it. Because what is the case against this at kind of a meta process level. And it's so overwhelming that you may assume it's not true. It can't be that overwhelming, right? It can't be like that, and so you go along with it. And, well, all of the outcomes that have been predicted by the detractors are manifesting in terms of weakened immunity and more variants as you roll out more and more of these jabs. Now you may respond, if this is true, if what you are saying was true, this is a bombshell and I would have heard about it. You'd think that, and you'd hope so, but why? Look, about 90% of all consumed media is controlled by 6 companies. So for some organized bullshit party, or conspiracy, if you want to use, that MK Ultra term for it, conspiracy theory, for this to happen, it's going to be easier today than any other time in U.S. history. Institutions in charge of what you see and hear are more centralized than they've ever been. Let's play pretend. If what I'm saying was true, who would tell you that what I'm saying is true? Okay, can you do that? Can you play pretend? Pretend that what I'm saying here is true. Who would tell you? Well, we can rule out anything owned by the Big Six. Okay, so that means basically all local papers. So anything like City Times, City Post is probably out. You may find an article here or there that gets through the cracks depending on how much control Gannett, for example, has on all these papers. But certainly at the beginning, it's going to be lockstep narrative. This stuff works, jam down, effectively ban ivermectin as far as it can be gotten away with through the legal system. What about sites like BuzzFeed? Oh, that's Verizon. So, no. Vice, I don't know who owns Vice, but you're not going to get much from there. If there was in fact a Big Six bullshit party, Verizon's propaganda arm would not tell you about it. None of the glorified blogs will tell you. What about the glorified vlogs, like CNN or whatever? Probably even less likely. Anything with like a 3-letter acronym and then news is owned by the Big Six, so no. What about stuff not owned by the Big Six? Will they spill the beans? Probably more likely to do so, but why would we assume that they would? Do they have some special knowledge? Just my personal view, but I have precisely zero faith in quote-unquote independent journalists to do anything other than push Big Six narratives twice as hard. If anything, they're going to call out City Times for not pushing, the scam of the year hard enough. Certainly the responsible adults at Dell or the FDA would blow the whistle on such a thing. Well, they get 45%, not 75%. Some guys got in trouble for saying it was 75%. But 45%, nearly half of the funding for the FDA, comes from the review budget, which is to say from pharma companies trying to get drugs through the FDA review process. This doesn't necessarily make them wrong about anything they say, but you certainly shouldn't be relying on them as some kind of authority. And there's other guys who show people who travel nonchalantly between pharma companies and the FDA and CDC. So financial incentives aside, it's kind of a nominal distinction between these companies and the regulatory bodies that are supposed to be independent third parties. It's not even clear whether or not FDA and Pfizer are truly separate entities, or if there is a little bit of distance between them, how much. And look, don't confuse what something in theory is supposed to do with what it actually does. Sure, the FDA is supposed to be an impartial third party on these things, but like proclaiming that this organization is supposed to do X doesn't evidence in any way that it actually does X. Just because you got, the student body council from high school, they get a little bit older, spend time at frat parties, and now they're in the FDA, and they wear, they wear suits and nice dresses, right, and speak in a certain way, doesn't then mean that, what's actually done is X, right? You just put on a lot of, you're just putting on a lot of airs, right, to make it appear professional, sort of corporate, right? What term I use is corporate adult, right? Kind of these faith fronts, these sort of symbols that you can trust thing because we appear a certain way. So why isn't Trump himself blowing the whistle on this? Oh, even Trump himself isn't falling for the idea that the jabs don't work or that there's something rotten about this. I've been kind of vague about the something rotten, but this is a long video, as you can see, and I'll get into it. Well, Trump is a pathological narcissist, and back in September of 2019, he actually created the Vaccine Task Force. Yes, this was before Wuhan. This was 3 months before the quote-unquote surprise outbreak at Wuhan. Right? Trump created the Vaccine Task Force. Right? They were preparing for Wuhan before the surprise outbreak. Right? A surprise outbreak, which they had 3 months anticipated. They had anticipated 3 months in advance. The surprise outbreak that occurred 8 miles from a virology lab. So in a way, this whole song and dance is kind of Trump's baby. He's not going to say it was a fraud and a scam because he's technically the one who got the ball rolling. Though obviously there are much bigger forces than Trump behind it. Here's a funny headline from 2017 from CNN. It says, quote, Trump pledges to work with Big Pharma to lower drug prices. And no, I'm not reading this crap article, but it's kind of a funny headline. Maybe intended to make Trump seem stupid, like you're going to work with companies to make them make less money. Now, I have no idea what Trump was trying to do or what the plan was, or even if this is an honest portrayal of Trump. And of course, I'm not, that would be a research project to figure out if that headline is true, and there's not going to be hardly anything in the article. Right, that would be a massive research project, and there's nothing in the article that could tell me one way or another, right? Because you read one of these glorified blogs, you have no idea what they're leaving out. They don't link to anything, right? They just sort of say things. They say a person said a thing, and you just sort of have to trust them, right? It's all there's no transparency, and there's no verification that anything said on CNN is true unless they're actually playing a video clip, and even then there's ways to screw around with the meaning of that. And I have to ask all you guys who hated Trump, obviously I'm not a fan, but like you guys see him as like especially bad. Well, let me put it this way, all of like the character problems of Trump that you see, like 95% of them I agree with. So basically how negatively you view Trump is about as negatively as I view Trump. Right? Now there's a few things that you're like real nuts about. Like for example, some of the stuff for example, believing that he mocked a disabled reporter. He did not. Right? There's no way that he had there was no way for him to know that the reporter that he was doing like the retard mocking actually had his arm like that, right? And so there's a whole bunch of little things like that lies about Trump that I didn't fall for. But in terms of him just being a generally awful person, like yeah, like I see it too. I'm not blind, okay? But the thing is, as awful a person as Trump is, okay, but I think he's less awful of a human being than, say, Colin Powell. I think Colin Powell is a much more horrible person than Trump. Name a person that you like. Trump is probably better than them just on a pure personal level. But I have to ask you, are you guys enjoying being on Trump's side in all of this? Like, the one issue where Trump supporters generally think that Trump is an idiot on, like this jab thing, right? That's the issue where you're all in with Trump. A little bit interesting to me, maybe something to think about. So 0, run-up weirdness. So in the run-up to COVID, there were some funny things happening. Now, for those who can remember past your nose, do you recall this clearly astroturfed anti-vaxxer campaign back in 2018? I do. Well, just because you remember something doesn't mean it actually happened. People remember all kinds of things. half of which may have actually happened, right? So I remember a big bugaboo about anti-vaxxers and the menace that they posed, right? It seemed weird. Why are they doing this? Like, anti-vaxxers, quote unquote, or, you know, the label applied to them, but these people have been around forever. Now, at the time, I didn't think much of it, right? It looks like just another hobby horse that the shitlib blogs and vlogs wanted to go prattle on about. But was I hallucinating? Was this in fact happening? Well, why don't you guess what my answer will be, since I brought it up in a presentation? Correct. No, I was not hallucinating. There are two measures that I looked at here. And I know it's raining very loudly, but I'm going to keep going. One was Google ngram, which is book mentions for anti-vax and anti-vaxxer. So you see anti-vaxxer became a big hobby horse for bookmakers starting in 2011 or so. So the next measure I looked at was Google searches. In a previous video that I presented a graph, and people didn't like the graph that I presented. Okay, whatever. I just made a new one that used more terms and had a longer time scale, so you can see, so it's much more stark and visible, the change. So there, now you can see it. I can't canvas all media. That's ridiculous. So this is a way of inferring interest spikes. What you would expect if there was a big shit bullshit party about anti-vaxxers and the menace of anti-vaxxers. Now, New York Times used to have a feature that let you track word use in their digital and paper blogs, but they removed that. And I think it was because people started making charts like this, right? Now, even though the bones of this data isn't available, this was made out of the old the New York Times Chronicle thing. Now, just a question here: does this track when white people became a real big problem recently? Right? And yeah, you're not going to say, you're going to say white supremacist. Okay, you have a problem with supremacists? No, shut up. Right? The key there is white supremacist is just a beard, like a softener. Right? Okay, so when did white people become a problem? Right? Well, you can probably look at the New York Times Chronicle and look at word use and sort of mark where on the graph you started to become aware of how rotten white people are, right? So anyway, in 2018, suddenly anti-vaxxer became something for you to care about. And if around 2018 you started really getting into like anti-vaxxer menace, bad, blah, well then you got big sixed. It doesn't matter if you say, I don't trust the media. Like, look, they tell you what to believe, and in all likelihood you believe it. Whether you don't like them, you don't like their face, you know of this or that ticky-tack thing that they got wrong. Like there's a thing about, they reported on it, and it's like, wow, they got that horribly wrong. I don't trust them. But then, they say things, and then that becomes your focus, right? Your focus becomes, moves away from, big business bad to white people bad. And this would be sort of bad in itself if this was just sort of happening to you in a vacuum. But the problem is that you seek to inflict sort of the punchlines to all these narratives, these big sixes, the punchlines of all these bullshit parties onto those of us who don't fall for them. Okay, that's the problem. So that's why I'm using search terms here, because I can't canvas everything, every city times, city post, 3-letter vlog, or corporate, independent radical journalism, yeah, MTV generation, Spokeshole says. But I can infer that there was such a campaign because of the search interest. So, all right. September 19, 2019, Trump's executive order. It's a big, long thing. And as always, it's linked in the description, but I'm going to highlight sections 2 and 3 here. The title of the order is Executive Order on Modernizing Influenza Vaccines in the United States to Promote National Security and Public Health. Oh, good. Oh, wonderful. Anyway, So here's Section 2, Policy. It is the policy of the United States to modernize the domestic influenza vaccine enterprise to be highly responsive, flexible, scalable, and more effective at preventing the spread of influenza viruses. This is a public health and national security priority, as influenza has the potential to significantly harm the United States and our interests, including through large-scale illness and death, disruption to military operations, and damage to the economy. This order directs actions to reduce the United States' reliance on egg-based influenza vaccine production. Okay? Egg-based influenza vaccine production, i.e. traditional vaccine production, to expand domestic capacity of alternative methods that allow more agile and rapid responses to emerging influenza viruses, to advance the development of new broadly protective vaccine candidates that provide more effective and longer-lasting immunities, and to support the promotion of increased influenza vaccine immunization across recommended populations. Okay, so I'm saying it's reading between the lines for, egg-based influenza vaccine production. That's just the traditional sort of deactivated virus, right? You grow a whole bunch of the viruses, sterilize it, put it traditional vaccines, right? And alternative methods, I'm reading between the lines mRNA, right? The whole mRNA thing, where basically the vaccine, quote unquote, infects your cells, causes it to produce the spike protein. Okay, that's what I'm reading there. Now, am I reading something that's not there? Perhaps, but whether I'm reading between the lines correctly or incorrectly, the point still stands. There was, in fact, the National Vaccine Task Force. Section 3, National Vaccine Task Force. A. There is hereby established a National Influenza Vaccine Task Force. The task force shall identify actions to achieve the objectives identified in Section 2 of this order and monitor and report the implementation of results of those actions. The task force shall be co-chaired by the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of Health and Human Services or their designees. Now, people want to say Trump wasn't in on it. Maybe, maybe not. For me personally, his failure to drain the swamp is evidence that he's part of something, but whatever. Trump's loyalties are a completely different topic unto itself. Whether he was in on this whole thing and was one of the driving forces behind this whole COVID program, the virus and the injections, or some sort of worm tongue came up to him and gave him some Chinese whispers and convinced him to do this, the point is that the response to COVID predates the release of COVID. And it's centered around vaccines. Or at least this executive order did. Which I think reflects some overall plan, which appears to be playing out as being focused on vaccines. There's more run-up weirdness. I would recommend looking into Event 201, which was a Bill and Melinda Gates sponsored pandemic response scenario. There's also Bill Gates running around saying a pandemic is coming, from like 2016 to today. I personally think Billy Boy here, who made his billions selling malware disguised as an operating system, is thinking, people will think I'm really smart if I predict, quote unquote, a big pandemic, which I think he had insider knowledge was coming. Oh, I'm sorry. Am I getting too conspiracy theory there? Is that too conspiracy theory? Is this not allowed to be true because conspiracy theory? Because MK Ultra conspiracy theory? I was told X is conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theory is pathologized label. Therefore, X, if it can be effectively labeled conspiracy theory, is therefore wrong, right? Right. Vaccine mandates or vaccine passports. Oh, that's conspiracy theory. Remember that. Remember vaccine passports, conspiracy theory. Okay. You'll get fired from your job if you don't get the jab. That's a conspiracy theory. You're a conspiracy theorist if you believe that. Anyway, so the World Health Organization, right before the Wuhan surprise outbreak, started jacking up funding for outbreak and crisis response and scalable operations. Wow, they had some amazing foresight there, didn't they? So you had Bill Gates running around predicting a pandemic. The World Health Organization is jacking up funding for an outbreak response. Big Six media is pushing a narrative about the anti-vaxxer menace. Oh, these horrible anti-vaxxers. Okay, you're horrible if you're an anti-vaxxer. You know, Bill Gates is running around going, look at me, I'm predicting a pandemic. Aren't I smart? And then, you know, September of 2019, right, 3 months before the Wuhan surprise outbreak and started hitting the news, we got Trump and his vaccine task force. Oh yes, Mr. Trump, you're the president doing important presidential things. Look at that serious face. He's making a serious face, contemplating all of the serious things that he has to do because he's the president, right? Okay. So, treatments. Now, I've already touched on this at the beginning with my little, you know, switcheroo. But let's just reiterate this. So there's a series of sites, the author of whom I have not been able to identify, whom I suspect wishes to remain anonymous, and thus I did not pry into who the author is. But it doesn't matter, right? Because he presents data, it's transparent, links out to the study. So you don't need to know who the author is, right? Arguments are true or false on their own. They are inert, right? Sources don't matter. Okay, that's something to kind of grow out of, is to go, you know, source doesn't matter. Thing is true or not. Okay, and but anyway. So, and also if you want to say, well, I can't evaluate it myself. I need some third party to evaluate it for me. Okay, problem. What then defines what is the authoritative third party to evaluate the data in and of itself for you? Right? There's no mechanism for vetting, you know, good third parties. But anyway, that's a problem in and to itself. How to make decisions with the absence of any understanding of the topic. Tend to outsource to authorities, but the problem is you don't have any way to evaluate who authorities are. Right? What you're sort of going by is like these kind of markers, right? Get a Dell sort of thing. So anyway, he has a series of sites, the first of which I found was IVM Meta, right? Ivermectin Meta. It's what is called a meta-analysis of a bunch of studies on the efficacy of ivermectin on COVID, but there's a whole bunch of other ones that look at this for a bunch of other drugs. A meta-analysis is just a fancy word for pooling the results of a bunch of studies. So the site has a lot of studies and a place where anyone can submit the results of studies. And on the page, he links to every individual study. I was first looking at ivermectin, but this guy also does it with a whole bunch of other things. What I looked at was ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine because those have been specifically smeared as ineffective and dangerous, right? The horse dewormer canard. So I also looked at vitamin A, D, C, zinc, aspirin, and melatonin, since those are available over the counter, and I also looked at remdesivir because that has been the most common institutionally sanctioned, right, sort of system-promoted treatment. I say institutionally sanctioned, and you may be asking which institution. Look, in practice it doesn't matter, right? There is a nexus of institutions, FDA, CDC, Google, Amazon, and they work as one, okay? So it doesn't, like, and they tend to conform to, like, narratives. And when they don't conform, you can point out where that is and where there's a disagreement between Amazon and the FDA. But, like, there's a tendency towards conformity on singular narratives between all institutions, forming, like, the hegemonic cult. And there's words for it in the past called the spirit of the age, or the zeitgeist, or the ghost of the nation, or whatever, okay? So when we say institutionally sanctioned, it's just all institutions to varying degrees, okay? And needling that further is kind of an academic thing. So I just simplified the results of these into a few studies. Now, when I did this, there were only 65 studies on ivermectin up on this site. Now there's over 70. So while my simplification is dated, it's not going to really matter. So in this table, K is just the number of studies, N is the total sample size of the control and treatment combined in all of that class of studies. There's a gray X where I decided there wasn't a good enough study sample size combination to include. If you disagree from my exclusion criteria, which is not explicit, it's just sort of eyeballing it, whatever. Everything's linked. Do it yourself, right? Include or reject whatever you want, all right? This, like, so you don't have to rely on me being, if you think I'm being dishonest or trying to mislead or whatever. Okay, it's all there. Go, you know. Get to work then, okay? You know. ES is effect size, not in the technical statistical sense, but just in the percentage mortality reduction. Okay, so as a preventative, which goes by the fancy name prophylaxis, that just means preventative. That's academese for preventative. Aspirin does basically nothing as a preventative. Hydroxychloroquine, HCQ, does basically nothing as a preventative. Vitamin D has a 24% reduction in mortality. Zinc has a 79% reduction in mortality, and ivermectin has a 96% reduction. Now, only 2 studies on ivermectin as a preventative and with non-standardized sample size, but the effect size is so huge that, you know, we should include it, even if you want to give it a grain of salt, right? Even if you would say, well, we're not going to give it much weight, but the effect size is so profound that I think is worth noting. So as an early treatment, hydroxychloroquine is super effective with 75% reduction. Vitamin D is even more effective at 79%, and ivermectin is also fairly effective at 52%. Late treatment is where they have the best data across the board, except for vitamin A, which didn't satisfy my eyeball test in any category. Aspirin reduced death by 23% in late treatment. Remdesivir, 19%, hydroxychloroquine at 19%, vitamin D at 56%, vitamin C at 20%, zinc at 31%, melatonin at 79%, which I suspect is just because it causes people to sleep more. But whatever the mechanism, that's the result, and ivermectin, again, solid at 52%. And I made little charts here for you to see. You know, with these kinds of videos, like, obviously the first thing that you did here was look at the description where I linked to all the things I was saying. Right? The description, right? You always check the description, always, 100% of the time. So I'm just assuming you read the description. Before even starting the video, you have the description pulled up and you have tabs open from stuff in the description. Just, you know, of course, right? Because you'd be kind of pretty irresponsible to not do that for every video, right, of mine or anyone else. And then, obviously, what you did is you went down to the IVM meta, for example, that I linked to, and you looked through this, and you clicked on a study that you wanted to see. Perhaps there was a paywall, right? And if there was a paywall in one of these things, obviously you use Sci-Hub, right? Because you know about Sci-Hub, like, because you want to know things, right? You want to know, like, you want to see the results of studies. So, obviously, because you want to know studies, you know, because you believe in, like, science or whatever, well, part of science is actually seeing data directly presented, not behind a paywall and not interpreted by someone else, right? So obviously, through your drive to actually see the data, you've almost certainly learned about Sci-Hub. Because what kind of a person would you be to claim to be all about the science, but then all you're doing is you're trusting paywalled articles, then what's behind the paywall being interpreted for you by something else, right? That would be kind of you'd be kind of a bad person if you were doing that. So obviously you know about Sci-Hub, so I don't have to really go into much detail about that. You know how to find the site when the site goes down, so there's no reason to, like, come to me and say, hey, Sci-Hub.io is down. Like, there's no need to come to me to figure out how to fix that, right? Because you've self-solved that. And obviously what you're going to do on the IVM meta, right, you're going to go to the site, you're going to click a few studies, you're going to read over them and make sure that what they say is what this guy is saying and putting in his table there, right? Obviously the random sting method, right, which no doubt, I mean, it's no doubt what you've done for the other meta-analyses that you've looked at, right? The other meta-analyses that you have looked at, right? You go through a random sting of, say, 5 or 6 studies, say, oh, this is a meta-analysis of all these studies, here's what he's reporting the results to be. I'm going to look at those 5 or 6 studies, go over them, make sure they check out on these sort of random locations that I'm sampling, right? And if they pass those, you then assume the rest are accurately reported, right? Perfectly sensible thing to do. So no doubt you've already done that, and me stating that you did this is kind of a waste of time, right? So thus I'll leave some dead air here for you to go ahead and press pause and come back when you're done with your random sting that you have been waiting to do, but were being sort of interrupted by my incessant babbling. Okay, now, having had this presented to you, and assuming that the sting thing that you did checked out, if you still believe Merck and Pfizer and the FDA and CDC and City Times or City Post or whatever, if this doesn't change your mind on treatments away from sort of the media-presented expert consensus or MPEC, if this doesn't do it, nothing will. Because practically speaking, it doesn't get any better than this. The case against institutional narrative doesn't get more one-sided and well-evidenced than this. Yeah, you can always have more studies, sure, okay? And don't do that thing where you present one study that you say says the opposite. Don't do that. First, check that a singular study that says ivermectin don't work that you want to throw at me isn't already included in this analysis. If it's not already included, okay, send that study to put into that overall analysis. Don't come crying to me until you have submitted that study to this site and then it has been rejected if you believe the reasons for rejection are unfair. Okay? But do not present singular studies on treatment in any comments anywhere until you have gone through that particular process for the IVM meta guy and the study that you presented has been rejected. Again, it goes back to it may be easier if if it was actually less of a slam dunk case, right? That if the case was actually weaker, it may be easier to convey it, because what I'm saying is on for example, the effectiveness of all these treatments sounds so extreme, and it is extreme, right? And that's what a good chunk of the U.S. population has been saying, that the institutions in the U.S. are extreme and they are deranged, right? So this kind of stuff that I see here, if you're kind of a system believer or something, then this is going to seem incredible. To me, it's not incredible. To me, this is par for the course. Stuff like this happens all the time. You don't hear it because Big Six, MPEC, and then they tell you you're smart for believing it. Done, right? Science TM, and you're not going to hear it from, say, YouTube or any social media, because they have terms of service that bans what you see. So if I go on the internet to get alternative views, well, your alternative views, one, there's a good chance your alternative views are owned by like the Big Six. But if they're not, and it's just some random guy, okay, well, he's limited in what he can say by the terms of service, right? You're not allowed to say ivermectin works. So if ivermectin works, you're not going to hear it from YouTube, for example. And it's probably the same way with Facebook and stuff. Okay, let's look at policy switches on ivermectin. This references a lot of country data, so take it with a grain of salt, because, countries report things, governments and institutions, they report things, who knows, which is why I don't think between country comparisons on COVID deaths or vaccine reactions mean anything, because who reports what by what standard, where and when, who the hell knows. Death, now if you're doing death rates between EU countries, okay, that's where you're getting some more standardization, because the EU, you get standardization in reporting methods to some degree. Sometimes you have actually things like Interpol that has a standardized reporting metric between countries. So within countries, I'm presenting this data on ivermectin policy shifts with a key assumption here, that the reporting criteria and vigor are unchanged over the visible time of the graphs. To the degree that that assumption is correct, that this data on the effect of ivermectin policy switches is meaningful. if this assumption is wrong, then this data can be tainted or even meaningless for each individual country. So all those caveats aside, here's what we got. So let's look at policy changes and within country differences. So Czechia approves ivermectin, then their recorded deaths collapse. Slovakia approves ivermectin, their recorded COVID deaths collapse, assuming that there was no change in definition of COVID deaths. This seems to be an inflection point. Here's Mexico. Ivermectin is available over the counter in Mexico, but this was, doctors can now prescribe it. Panama. There's Panama. There you go. Peru. Now, Peru, we have a fun little story. Ivermectin gets approved. Deaths go down. New president takes over. Bans ivermectin. Deaths go up. He trusted the science, TM, right? He trusted the science, TM. Now, in India, we have COVID deaths from 3 provinces. 2 use ivermectin, 1 doesn't. Can you guess which one isn't using ivermectin? Just a wild guess. Oh, wow, you guessed correctly. Okay. Now, if you want to say one or several of these countries changed their reporting standards over time, thus nullifying the meaningfulness of their ivermectin policy in that particular country or countries at the relevant time, like, it's a possibility, sure, but at a kind of first pass, it's not immediately obvious that, according to usual suspects, that ivermectin is just a horse dewormer or horse paste that is ineffective against COVID deaths. Right? It appears to be super effective. Now, there is institutional denial on this point, and it references between country comparisons. At the time of writing this, I just instinctively skipped between country comparisons because that's obviously nonsense. I wasn't aware that this is precisely what the deniers are doing. It didn't even enter my mind to compare countries because that's obviously retarded. But I guess I should have seen it coming because that's what, the World Health Organization and all sorts of corporate adult orgs do. I mean, it's complete trash of a comparison, but it's trash that's given a veneer of responsible professionalness. So yeah, comparing between countries is obviously stupid. Comparing within a country, even within a country, the country might be too big or have different reporting standards between districts or states or provinces. My thought process goes exactly the other way. That heterogeneous reporting standards could render any overarching claims about certain countries meaningless. I doubt that's the case for countries like Czechia or Slovakia or Peru, or Panama, but India maybe, and Peru may be too big. And yet the deniers just bizarre. They have no problem accepting at face value numbers between countries. The degree to which these people just accept data is crazy. Does Russia have more COVID deaths than Israel? Who knows? There's no way to tell. Right? Not that it's a fundamentally impossible thing to figure out, but as of this moment, there is no existing organization that can tell us if there are more COVID deaths in Israel or Russia. Right? Various agencies within those countries say things. That's it. And this is so obvious, I just take it as a given, but as I was editing, I realized some people may accept between country comparisons. It just seems insane. But if you don't think so, okay. But it's incumbent upon you to learn what the reporting standards they're using are and make sure they're counting COVID cases, a case, what the frick is a case, deaths or total deaths, or whatever metric you're using, the same way in every country you're comparing. This is not an unreasonable bar to set. In the clinical studies collated at IVM Meta, that's exactly what they're doing. There's no random, wild, unknown standards between districts within a study that they're doing, right? It's all the study's specific protocol. Now, perhaps when comparing between studies, okay, but within any given study, it's the same protocol. Now, for within countries, I'm making a leap of faith here, assuming that reporting standards don't vary between different parts within Czechia or within Slovakia or within Panama, so fair enough. But that is an assumption I'm making, and so I guess this somewhat boomerangs back to what I'm doing, but only somewhat. Because clearly, different parts of Czechia aren't supposed to have different reporting criteria from each other. Whereas between two different countries, like, all bets are off as to what they're reporting. You know, as an aside, like go back to, like, GDP. In World War II, for example, you know, there's all this talk about GDP, but then in World War II, suddenly GDP, like, just seemed to disappear from discourse, and everyone started talking about real things. Like in 1940, did Germany or the Soviet Union have a bigger GDP? Probably Germany, but, like, that was a question nobody cared to ask. They asked about steel production, truck production, oil, coal, grain. Now, even with something as straightforward as, like, tons of steel or kilometers of railroad, even with something as materially objective as that, you still got books being cooked. Especially with the Soviet Union, who was known to tell some real whoppers. So, given that even the material comparisons are between countries, like these material comparisons are fraught, what on earth would possess one to trust data on something that is so subject to reporting, like, symptoms and categorization criteria as a disease? I mean, that's just a crazy level of faith and trust. It's an irresponsible level of trust, and it's just a complete lack of caution to do this. And so to even have your mind go to where these ivermectin deniers is going is something that's very alien and bizarre to me. It's pretty criminal what they're doing. And that's why a lot of people get emotional about this, and they say things like the Nuremberg. I think they're hoping for something like that. I don't think it'll happen. Sorry. I've been on this side of the issue too many times to have any faith that anything good is going to happen. I'm basically at the point where I really don't expect good things to happen. So, but what I can do is I can try to tell people and try to inform, you know, what I consider to be informing, right? And it's very straightforward, and it's oftentimes hard to believe because it's so, like, it's easier to convince someone that one thing some guy said was a lie than that 90% of what this guy says is a lie. And basically what I'm saying is, like, yeah, like, the whole thing is a lie from top to bottom. Every element of the story about the COVID virus and the jabs is a lie, like, in detail. And that's difficult to believe. And because the dishonesty is so comprehensive and overwhelming, there's a certain level of base incredulity at something that's something this brazenly rotten and false can be pushed, right? And so there's basically resistance. The strength of the argument is so strong that it can't be real, sort of the thing. Okay, so second thing, the virus came from a lab. Now, this is a somewhat deprecated talking point because, and this is a surprise to me, that there has actually been a little bit of a crack up even in the Big Six bullshit party about the virus's origins. That yes, the U.S. government was funding development of coronavirus research. As bioweapons, like, okay, what else would it be? Like, I mean, we don't 100% know for sure that it's bioweapons, but, like, so yes, Fauci was funding bioweapons research in China, and this COVID thing is a prototype that quote-unquote got loose. Now, China's supposed to be our enemy, right? So why are we cooperating with the Chinese for bioweapons research? That's a rabbit hole for another time. So early on, you had a massive media jam down on this. People were getting banned from all of the social media sites for saying lab origin. To what little credit we can give them, sites like Facebook and Twitter have since reversed that jam down. I don't know about YouTube, but they have since reversed that censorship. But the fact that they were censoring in the first place, let's not go, you went back up to like not censoring people who pointed out this obvious thing, that a virus that broke out 8 miles from a virology lab that was specifically working on developing coronavirus variants may be the origin of this novel coronavirus. And you were banned for saying that. It's retarded. It's that retarded, right? And it's total. It's totally social, right? It's a total social authority game. So anyway, this is from the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis. It's a long thing. Both the video and the testimony and the text will be linked in the video description, along with everything else. I'm going to give you my notes for it, okay, because it's too long. But if you don't trust my notes or whatever, full thing is linked in the description in both formats, both the text form and what he read to the Select Subcommittee, right? Whatever. If you think I'm lying, fine. You think you don't trust my interpretation, you don't trust my notes, fine. There it is. Go see it yourself. Right? If you think that I'm like doing this because I'm like trying to misinform you or something, it's like, ooh, the vax, it actually works, but I want people to not take it and eat horse paste and die. That's my motive. Like, I don't know what you people are even thinking. Like anyway. So here's my notes of Stephen Quay's presentation. COVID-19 didn't begin in Huanan seafood market. None of the 11 patients from the Huanan market had the earliest COVID-19 strain. All 4 patients with the earliest genetic version of the virus had no contact with the Huanan market. The first patient, January 2020, with the earliest COVID-19 sequence was treated at a hospital of the Central Theater Command of the PLA, Chinese Army, roughly 3 kilometers from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. None of the environmental specimens in Huanan have the earliest strain, which means they probably came into the market. 457 animals from Huanan market were tested and found negative for any COVID-19. 616 animals from suppliers to the Huanan market were tested and found negative for any COVID-19. 1,086 wild animals of the type found in the market were also tested, all negative for any COVID-19. 80,000 samples tested from 209 specimens from other markets, farms, and wildlife areas throughout China. A COVID-19 virus was not found in a single specimen. The probability for a community-acquired infection is, quote-unquote, about 1 in 1 million. Okay, this is me talking here. I think he's just saying 1 in a million as kind of like a colloquialism. Frankly, I think the odds are a lot less likely than this, but continuing. After testing 9,952 stored human blood specimens from hospitals in Wuhan from before December 2019, or December 29, 2019, there was not a single case of COVID-19 in any specimen. It was expected that around 250 would be positive. The possibility of this for a community-acquired infection is also about 1 in a million. For MERS and SARS-1, the earlier transmissions were mostly animal-to-human transmission. For SARS-CoV-2, 249 cases were examined genetically, and they were all human-to-human transmission. For a community-acquired infection, this is a probability of 0.5 to the 249th power, getting heads on a coin toss 249 times in a row. Right? Basically not going to happen. So I don't know how they can determine if it was human to human or animal to human, but apparently they say they can, That's what he said. I'll just present that as a possibility that they have the ability to do that and not comment any further. Maybe they do have that ability, maybe they don't. I don't know. SARS-CoV-2 has a unique trigger on a surface called a furin cleavage site and a unique code in the genes for that site called a CGG-CGG dimer. These are two independent levels of uniqueness, the furin cleavage site and the unique code for that site. The furin site is why the virus is so transmissible. The entire group of coronavirus, i.e. not COVID-19, do not contain a furin cleavage site or the CGG-CGG dimer code. Since 1992, in gain-of-function experiments, the furin sites have been inserted repeatedly. This is my notes of what he said. If you think he explained that further, I don't recall him doing so as I was writing out the notes, but if you think he did, original thing is in the description. This CGG-CGG code is commonly used around the world, including the Wuhan Institute of Virology. You can literally order this code from a supply company on the internet. My notes of what he said. SARS-CoV-2 was pre-adapted for human-to-human transmission from the very first patient. Just my notes of what he said. Oh, and this is in direct quotes. The part of the virus that interacts with human cells was 99.5% optimized. SARS-1 was 17% optimized. Okay. So, if all this is true, well then the lab leak becomes about as close to a fact as a thing can be. Stephen Quay then did a much larger analysis tracking, and it was more tracking what he thinks are the big pieces of evidence that drive the likelihood of a lab leak to nearly 100%. Now, in his formal analysis, the big odds pushers for him are like the locations for the first cases near Wuhan Institute of Virology, the lack of evidence for seroconversion, I don't know what that means, in Wuhan and in Shanghai, the lack of posterior diversity, okay, the lack of furin cleavage sites in any other sarbecovirus, okay, don't know what a furin cleavage site, but he said that before, rare usage of CGG single codons and no CGG-CGG pairs, okay, and routing use of CFF in laboratory codon optimization, including Daszak and Xi. I don't know what this means, but he thinks those are big deals. Okay. What I understand is the testing of food and animals and the blood supply. So I can look at that and say it almost certainly did not come from animals. Right, so the animal explanation is false. Now you want to say, well, it didn't come from animals, but maybe it's naturally occurring but originated in humans. It's like, okay, see, now what you're doing is you're like, okay, so there was an original story. It was wrong. The virology lab, we know the physical location of the virology lab. It's right next to the Wuhan seafood market. There was a big campaign to suppress the lab leak, that it came from a lab. Okay. We now know the U.S. was funding that research at that lab. I don't know, man. Like how, like I just don't see where, one would be getting, and we've ruled out animals as the origin. Now, there's this guy, Stephen Quay, he's saying all this stuff about the CGG dimer and the furin cleavage sites and all these things. I don't know what those mean. Right? I'm not a virologist, so I don't understand that. Just going off of what he's saying that I do understand, it sure looks like it came from the lab. And if it originated in humans, it just naturally evolved in humans, I guess that's a possibility, but then we have to deal with the fact that the lab is right there, right next to Wuhan, and it's a coronavirus, which is what that lab was working with. right? And then, of course, there's all the run-up weirdness, like anti-vaxxer, right? And Bill Gates running around talking about an influenza epidemic. So I haven't seen any rebuttals to Quay's analysis, and I have a suspicion why there have been none to my knowledge. One, it's probably easier to just ignore it. I think that's one reason why people don't respond to things. You just ignore, especially when you have a bigger audience than they do. Two, no one person can fact-check Quay's work. It would be an extensive operation to fabricate a debunking of Quay's research or to legitimately refute it if it happened to be wrong. So basically the difficulty, the work involved to either legitimately refute or dishonestly, quote-unquote, debunk is just a lot of work. So that's a barrier there. Third, Quay's arguments are redundant. Him being wrong about one thing doesn't imply the other things are wrong. Like, there's no central supposition underlying all the stuff he's saying. So you can't say he's wrong about this and that unravels the whole argument, right? His argumentative points, they're all independent. There's no kill shot against it. Okay, so in February of 2020, the Lancet really flexed their authority status on this issue with this kind of gross jam-down letter. The statement is linked in the description, and I'll just go ahead and read it here. We are public health scientists who have closely followed the emergence of 2019 novel coronavirus disease, COVID-19, and are deeply concerned about its impact on global health and well-being. We have watched as the scientists, public health professionals, and medical professionals of China in particular have worked diligently and effectively to rapidly identify the pathogen behind this outbreak, put in place significant measures to reduce its impact, and share their results transparently with the global health community. This effort has been remarkable. We sign this statement in solidarity with all scientists and health professionals in China who continue to save lives and protect global health during the challenge of the COVID-19 outbreak. We are all in this together, with our Chinese counterparts in the forefront against this new viral threat. The rapid, open, and transparent sharing of data on this outbreak is now being threatened by rumors and misinformation around its origins. We stand together to strongly condemn conspiracy theories suggesting that COVID-19 does not have a natural origin. Scientists from multiple countries have published and analyzed genomes of the causative agent, severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, SARS-CoV-2, and they overwhelmingly conclude that this coronavirus originated in wildlife. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. They're slamming the gavel on that source flood. They're slamming it, slamming some papers that they say what they say. As of so many other emerging pathogens. 11, 12. This is further supported by a letter from the presidents of the U.S. National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and by the scientific communities they represent. They represent? So, some guy from some club signs something. But that then becomes science. See how this centralization process works? Conspiracy theories do nothing but create fear, rumors, and prejudice that jeopardize our global collaboration in the fight against the virus. We support the call from the Director General of World Health Organization to promote scientific evidence and unity over misinformation and conjecture. We want you, the science and health professionals of China, to know that we stand with you in your fight against this virus. We invite others to join us in supporting the scientists, public health professionals, and medical professionals of Wuhan and across China. Stand with our colleagues on the front line. We speak in one voice. To add your support for this statement, sign our letter online. LM is editor of pro-med male. We declare no competing interests. So yeah, we speak in one voice. Stand with us on the front line against me. That seems to be what it is. Stand on the front line against Ryan, who's trying to mislead you and tell you the virus came from the virology lab that was 8 miles from where the virus outbreak happened. And I kept the image on here, not just the text, because the page itself has all sorts of superscript links, all the references, all of the markings and all the accoutrement of authority, right? This is all goes into like the corporate adult thing, right? Not just the raw text, but all of those authority marking supports. If you just say the text, it's kind of sterile and doesn't give you an idea of kind of the blast, the authority blast, the authoritative blast, right? You talk about misinformation, like who has the power to push, like let's say you want to push a deliberate lie. Who has the power to do that, right? Groups like the Lancet have the power to do that, right? And potentially the power to get away with that for a certain amount of time. Recently, the CDC, they're retiring the PCR test January 1st. So the lie of the PCR test, that was able to be pushed for a while, but it wasn't. So they were able to keep that lie in for a while. But apparently there were enough people in the CDC who were saying, "Look, we got to stop the scam. Like these PCR tests, they don't find the COVID. Like we don't have the ability to find the COVID, at least not out in the field. Like that's science fiction. It's not true. Stop." I don't know if that's what they said, but that's the reality. So like the PCR testing and that was a lie. That was like PCR tests work. That was misinformation, right? Right now I can just come out and say that as fact. The PCR test works. That's misinformation. Okay, who has the power to push that misinformation? Things like the FDA and CDC. Okay, so if you're concerned about misinformation, why not be concerned about the agencies that have the power to push the misinformation? Like Lancet in this letter here saying, the virus came from a bat or something, right? Which we know is not true. Like now, did it decisively come from a lab? Well, those dots are pretty close together. But okay, fine. We don't have like the smoking gun that it came from the lab, but we know that the original story that it came from animals is false, and we can look at a map and see how close the virology lab is, right? And we can track the first cases that came from a Chinese military base, only 3 miles from the lab, right? So when you're concerned about misinformation, you need to be concerned about who has the power and who has the conflict of interest to push to say something that might be false. So in terms of power and conflict, like for example, for me to say this stuff about like ivermectin working, that's stuff that gets banned on YouTube. Okay, that stuff maybe it's banned. Is it banned on Facebook? I haven't checked. But see the thing is, there's no incentive for people to go out and say that. They say that because they think it's true, and they think it's more important to say what is true than what's necessarily in their personal best interest. Okay, because what's in your personal best interest is to either just say nothing or toe the line. Okay, so in terms of power and potential conflict of interest to push misinformation, it's going to be things like the FDA and CDC that are going to push these things. Same with the masks. Right now the CDC is coming out and saying at least the simple masks that you get at the drugstore don't do anything. They're just decorations. Okay, that's finally coming out. Okay, so idea masks work. That was misinformation. They were misinforming you. That was misinformation. You were misinformed about that. Okay, so like the war on misinformation, that's a war on Google. Okay, that's a war on Facebook. That's a war on FDA. That's a war on CDC. That's a war on the pushers of misinformation, which is to say the system itself, right? The operating system is the malware, is what I'm saying on all this. Now, from a propaganda standpoint, this actually surprised me a little bit when Twitter and Facebook stopped banning people for saying there was a lab leak. And it was also surprising to me to see some like media outlets saying, yeah, there's probably a lab leak, and even The Hill posted something saying Rand Paul was right all along. So from a propaganda standpoint, this surprised me, because if the whole COVID program was under absolute control by some central cabal, there wouldn't be these crack-ups, right? Like if these people know they have effective media control, 90% direct control, and the rest of it is going to sort of go along with that 90% that people see. They know they have social media jammed down. They'll ban anybody going counter-narrative. Why do you care? Why would you backpedal on anything ever? Just continue to lie. Just say PCR tests work, masks work. The virus came from a bat. Right? Just keep lying. There's no reason for you to backpedal, because all that does is make people go, oh, that then sets the precedent. Oh, system, right? Sort of the nexus of institutions that push, singular narratives in one direction. They can be wrong. In fact, they themselves admit they're wrong, so that's basically it, right? Because there's like an undercurrent of pushback against them that seeps through the cracks. It says, you're wrong about this, you're wrong about this, you're wrong about this, and they just say no. And as soon as they admit on something, right, that issue is done. Right? As soon as like the CDC says like, oh, masks don't work, or the PCR test doesn't work, it's over. Right? Nobody's gonna right. There's no alternative media, like truly alternative media, that's gonna come out and say, no, the CDC is lying. PCR tests really do work. Right? There's no grassroots in that direction. All the grassroots is in the direction of things that are true, at least on these issues. So, and let me put it this way: because the faith in the PCR tests are purely authority based, you're not going to get like grassroots people going on to BitChute saying PCR tests work, because it's all based on that authority. And as soon as that authority removes itself from supporting that position, i.e. PCR tests work, you're not going to get right. It's not based on the facts on the ground. It's purely an authority play, an authority marker that PCR tests work. Right? It's just an authority like push. Like we authority say PCR tests work. Believe. Remove that authority. There's no on-case arguments or any information beneath that to support them. So as soon as you remove that authority, as the CDC is doing with PCR tests, then a shit lib is going to go, okay, I guess PCR tests don't work. But what's so sad about that is that that's what it takes. That's what it takes, right? And so that's why I use the term authority brain, right? Because I could be here all day. I could go look up a whole bunch of stuff. Here's why PCR tests don't work. They can't differentiate between viruses. Here's the mechanism. It can't tell the difference between different types of influenza. Right? I could do that all day, and it wouldn't mean a thing until CDC withdraws their support, because that logo, that faith, is then removed, and that's what it's about. And my hope is, I don't hold out much hope, but I have like a little spark of hope that maybe seeing all like the big institutions fail, especially in medical, which is supposed to be one of the harder establishments, right? Not as hard as like physics or engineering or something, but it's harder than say sociology, right? So it's one of the harder things. It's one of the harder fields. And if they get something royally wrong, like just straight up, something that they get royally wrong, which they have been in conflict with, oppositional, like a sizable oppositional group they call conspiracy theorists or whatever, on the matter of masks and PCR tests and the lab origin, right? So there's three right there. Three issues that have been resolved, and they're all in the favor against, right, big system, right? And fourth is ivermectin, but the thing is, the issue is only resolved when they remove their, when the system itself removes its support, or in this case, opposition. So even though, like, it's slam dunk that, like, I guess you could say anti-system are saying ivermectin works, system is like trying to eliminate it. Now, because of the legal system in the U.S., they can't outright ban it like they can in some countries. You know they want to. That issue I wouldn't class as resolved because authority hasn't withdrawn its support from opposition to ivermectin. So we have three, but the ivermectin stuff, right, it hasn't been formally resolved. Now, I think it's been informally resolved. I think that it's just overwhelming and one-sided and ridiculous and kind of a joke that we're even talking about this on ivermectin. But no, it's... But we could say there's at least three where the issue is resolved, that the authority itself has withdrawn its support from PCR tests, masks, and, you know, lab origin V. So anyway, so question here. Intentional release, plandemic. Well, there's a really, really dumb and wrong phrase that a lot of people say. So are you ready to hear the really dumb and wrong phrase that a lot of people say that you might say? Okay, here it is. Here's the dumb and wrong phrase. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Now, it's actually a meaningless statement, because what is an extraordinary claim is a function of your prior beliefs, right? You think something is extraordinary. Well, extraordinary to what? Extraordinary to you because of things you believe otherwise. And those things could just all be wrong. And so for you to come up here and say, oh, that is an extraordinary claim, is just like so presumptuous. It's presuming that all of your relevant priors, or what you evaluate as being relevant priors, are all correct for something to be extraordinary. Like, well, who made you king, king of Diaper Hill here? Like, the cliche example, I'll just use the cliche. The Earth is not the center of the universe, but is spinning around the sun, right? Now, imagine if astronomers demanded extraordinary evidence for that at the time. I mean, it's actually something, you just show it with a relatively simple calculus, and even like with visual diagrams for the enumerate. And the reason it eventually won out is just because it was a model that fit observations better, right? What is extraordinary is just like your opinion, man. So when you say extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, so what, you're just going to set the bar really high, like stupidly, retardedly high, for this thing that's obviously true, right? And just set the bar really high to where you'll just reject explanations that work better because it's an extraordinary claim, extraordinary based on your prior beliefs. No, the crisis is not with the thing in itself. The crisis is with your priors. The crisis is in your head. Okay? And now you have another problem, right? Which is that, first off, you say this is an extraordinary claim requiring extraordinary evidence. And when someone comes in and shows any evidence, well, you're not going to see it. It's going to get banned as misinformation, right? So when you say something like, oh, the jab doesn't work, well, that's an extraordinary claim that requires extraordinary evidence. Okay, so you're going to require some stupid level of evidence that is not practicable to acquire, right? Because we don't control anything, right? We don't have labs. We don't have any money. Like we don't have things to do that with, right? We're basically sitting, at the bottom, taking bits and pieces, showing clues that the whole thing's a fraud, right? So the first thing, that the level of evidence that you're demanding is basically impossible, right? For who you're demanding it from. So that's the first thing. And then, of course, even if we could acquire that evidence and then present it, which, I mean, here you see, like, the evidence on ivermectin is research that's been done by other people, by other researchers from around the world. Can't present that on YouTube. So how are you going to even see it? If you're going around, well, I haven't seen any extraordinary evidence. I spent a lot of time on YouTube and Facebook. Okay, well, it's banned there. It's banned. You post this video on YouTube, it will be banned as misinformation, right? Because I'm showing the benchmarks. You can't show the benchmarks on alternative PCs. Get a Dell. So when you say, like, the vaccine doesn't work, the mouth breathers who've been, big sixed will go, where's the evidence? And then you show them some, then it's like, why haven't I heard about this? If this was true, I would have heard about it. From where? From who? Who's going to tell you about it? I mean, you're getting something weird lately, like little crack-ups in the program. Anyway. Okay, let's go into variants. So here we have a little timeline. This is from NextStrain. The different colors are for nucleotide mutations. If they're the same color, that's said to be a non-nucleic variant. Now, I don't get this. A variant that has nothing to do with the RNA or DNA of the virus? So how does the variant persist if it has nothing to do with the germline? Well, whatever. My lack of understanding doesn't mean non-nucleic variants are impossible, nor do I know of any motive that NextStrain would have to lie about that. So, whatever. Non-nucleic variants, okay. Don't know how those would persist, but apparently they do. Okay. I'm not a virologist. Anyway, so you can see all the little variants here. And on the timeline, I drew a little line from when the first jabs en masse, the first max vaccination campaign started in the US and the UK. And oh boy, before this time there was a whole lot of nothing. It's all the alpha strain. And then the jabs start en masse. And then we get all these exciting new variants. So there's the first jab. And of course, people start getting jabbed more as time goes on. And they get the first lambda, the first gamma, the first alpha. In fairness, the first eta variant did predate the jab. Okay. But that doesn't seem to be a particularly concerning variant. Then we got the delta, which is apparently really concerning because the delta is vaccine resistant. That's what's concerning about it. It's vaccine, quote unquote, resistant. But wait a minute, there are people who will point out that the Delta variant was identified before the mass vaccination programs began anywhere. True. The first known example of the Delta variant was in India on October 5th, 2020. The big vaccine rollouts didn't begin anywhere until December of 2020. But wait another minute. You can't say conspiracy because I'm just cruising Wikipedia. This is from the page on Covaxin under history. In May 2020, Indian Council of Medical Research's ICMR's National Institute of Virology approved and provided the virus strains for developing a fully indigenous COVID-19 vaccine. In June 2020, the company received permission to conduct Phase 1 and Phase 2 human trials of a developmental COVID-19 vaccine, codenamed BBV152, from the Drugs Controller General of India, Government of India. A total of 12 sites were selected by the Indian Council for Medical Research for Phase 1 and 2 randomized, double-blind, and placebo-controlled trials of vaccine candidate. Singular? Okay. In January 2021, the company published Phase 1 trial results in the Lancet. Oh boy. On March 8, 2021, Phase 2 results were published in the Lancet. The study showed that Phase 2 trials had a higher immune response and induced T-cell response due to the difference in dosing regime from Phase 1. The doses in Phase 2 were given at 4-week intervals as opposed to 2 weeks in Phase 1. Neutralization response of the vaccine were found significantly higher in Phase 2. Well, there you go. While the mass appearance of Delta didn't come until around 3 months after the mass vax rollouts, the first known cases came before that, but the first known cases did come after people started getting injected in clinical trials. Sure, the big Delta surge didn't start until the big injection surges, But the very first appearance on a small scale came after the first quote-unquote vaccinations were done on a small scale in the earliest clinical trials. Okay? So again, these variants didn't come about until people started getting injected. And the more people started getting injected, the more you saw these variants. Okay, another piece of evidence that the jabs are creating the variants comes from this paper. It's an admittedly small sample size, but I've been having a very difficult time finding anything straightforward on this. This is from a paper entitled Predominance of Antibody-Resistant SARS-CoV-2 Variants in Vaccine Breakthrough Cases from the San Francisco Bay Area, California. At the top are numbers from the UCSF hospitals and clinics, and the bottom are from something called the Color Genomics Laboratory. So on the bottom here are what they've deduced are more antibody-resistant strain distributions and the more infectious distributions. So that's what they're saying, but this doesn't look like, at least in the sample in the San Francisco Bay Area, that it's the unvaccinated that are ground zero for the novel variants. Again, small sample size, just one area, but chalk up another one to the crazy conspiratorial idea that the injection-resistant strains, right, these injection-resistant strains of the virus might be caused by the injections, that it's an adaptation to a targeted thing that they're responding to. So there's also this weird, like, shit on the board kind of argument. It's not really an argument, it's just like a bizarre proclamation. Like, it's saying the unvaxxed are creating the variants. And this is like stunning gaslighting, like sort of a real kind of like sanity check kind of statement. Like just where, like, what planet are you from that you could say something like this? So, I mean, I was legitimately thunderstruck when I first started hearing people saying that the vaccine, quote-unquote, resistant variants, like this Delta variant, it's really bad. Why? Because it breaks through the vaccine. Who's causing the vaccine-resistant variants? Oh, the unvaccinated. It's crazy. So, I mean, back when nobody was getting injected, there were no nucleic variants. Okay, all of the nucleic variants started popping up when the jab started. And the mutation of these variants that makes them vaccine resistant are specifically mutations of what? The spike protein, which is precisely the part of the virus that these jabs are targeting. Right? The mRNA thing is going into you, it's making your cells produce these spike proteins, and that's what's mutating in the Delta variant, is the spike protein. The idea that the people who are unjabbed are creating the variants, it's so unbelievably shit on the board stupid. I don't know how to respond to it. It's insane. So let's put this together. The period where nobody's getting injected, there are no major variants cropping up. Then the jabs start in clinical trials. Then you see the first ticky-tack cases of the Delta variant. Then you have mass campaigns starting in December. Then you start seeing the mass arrival of the Delta variant, first and foremost, but also a bunch of new variants. So that's the brute correlational evidence. Now, if people were free mind, that would be enough to settle this quote-unquote issue. But again, it all ties back to the authority problem. All right, get Adele. At every other place in time in history, trusting tagged authorities on matters which possess religious fervor, right, be it theistic or non-theistic. And look, you can play stupid games about that, but religion or ideology, it's like pornography. It may be hard to define in some definitional sense. Defined in a definitional sense. Yeah, I said that. But you know it when you see it. And trusting tagged authorities on any matter that involves a religious movement or something with religious fervor behind it, which, you know, a good rule of thumb today would be anything that has justice affixed to it. That's like a religious issue. That any time in the past, trusting tagged authorities on things that have like a religious emotion behind it would always be a bad bet. That you're probably going to end up being wrong if you trust tagged authorities on issues that have religious feeling behind it. But apparently, you're lucky enough to be at the one place in time where the tagged authorities are always right and can be trusted on matters where there is, in fact, this level of religious fervor, like with, get the jab. These mRNA injections are very clearly such a matter, right? And the thing is, this jab thing and just the insane trust coupled with emotion to like force people to get jabbed, like this is evidence of something that I thought, so it's bittersweet because it's horrible, but it's also evidence of what I've been saying for a while, that all this stuff about like the narratives regarding slavery and segregation and World War II and like the entire stuff about race and white people bad, right? That whole arc, that's that like you believe that because authority, right? It's not about the doctrine. It's never been about the doctrine, right? And another thing that I've been pointing out is that the kinds of people who were communists in Nazi Germany flipped to the Nazis and went back and forth. I did a whole video looking at electoral results showing that the best predictor for Nazi support in an area was communist support, and the best predictor for communist support in an area in Germany was Nazi support. And I also showed that like the psychological traits of people who join cults, right? Neuroticism, depression, having a not clean room, a high level of disgust tolerance, that is they don't get disgusted by things, tending to have a messy room. Like, for example, people who call themselves liberals tend towards neuroticism. People who call themselves conservatives tend towards narcissism. It's not clinical in either direction. It's all fully functional, right? So when people say the term neurotic and narcissist, it's not at a dysfunctional level for either group, okay? So don't try to do like, clinical diagnosis. The point I'm making is that the kinds of people that join cults tend to be like shitlibs and stuff, right? So the doctrine doesn't matter, right? And the kinds of people who were in the Nazi Party are the kinds of people who were Bolsheviks and are today the kinds of people who are big system believers and system trusters. And almost certainly back in the day, I don't know this for sure, but I'm just sort of assuming based on what we know now, is that the old religious nutters back in like medieval Europe who did all the damage then were these kinds of people, right? That it's these kinds of people, these big authority trusters and big authority trusters and like cause pushers are like a global, like universal. And the thing is, this whole, like seeing it happen so rapidly and seeing that these system truster people, culty causey system truster people, seeing them flip so hard away from like the whole Occupy Wall Street thing, like and the riots against the free trade deals, and obviously it was just the flavor of the week, but by accident they happened to be saying a few things that were correct here and there in a lot of their antitrust stuff, right? They just incidentally they happened to say a few things that were true, the Occupy people, but to see them flip so hard from hating corporations to now supporting like mandatory injections from a corporation, and it's like $100 per injection, and they're immune to any and all liability, and it's under patent for like 50 years, is just nuts to see that's flip. But it's also just a massive confirmation of what I've been saying. It's the authoritarian brain, right? It's the authority brain. It's not about any specific doctrine, right? These kinds of people, like as kind of a guilty pleasure, and I'm kind of glad that I did this, is I used to spend like hours while doing other things just listening to ex-Scientologists talk about like Scientology. And to a man and woman, right, but to a man, any of them who ever said anything about politics once they left Scientology, right, most aren't public and they just sort of go about their lives, but anyone who started to opine about politics after they left Scientology, they were all turbo shitlibs. And it's funny, this asshole, Steve Hassan, right, who got conned into joining the Moonies, and now he's running around calling him, trying to tell people about cults. And of course he hates Trump and says, "Oh, the cult of Trump," right? And Tori Magoo, right, that dumb bitch, she was running around talking about like the cult of George Bush, which obviously, I mean, it's retarded, and we can see how retarded that is now. But like, you see, like, that's what they're doing. It's like, I was in a cult, and so now I'm an expert on cults, right? And you're in a cult. It's like, no, you're not an expert on. You are the exact opposite of an expert on cults, Hassan. Right? That's like saying, yeah, you should. I'll give you good advice on like navigating through the woods, because I got lost and almost died in the woods, so I'm like an expert on navigating through the woods. It's like yeah, I'm like an expert on cults, because like I got completely like brain owned by one. No, you are like the anti-expert on cults. You're an anti-expert. You are the opposite. Nobody should listen to anything you have to say about like psychologically controlling methods and people and organization. I mean, it's just amazing that like there's something so obvious that like people like Hassan and Tori Magoo, they're not experts on cults. They are anti-experts, right? They are what we call a counter indicator, right? Right, and so they're useful in a sense, like, okay, just take what they have to say about anything involving cults or religion or ideology and reverse it. The opposite. The opposite's going to be true. Right? Tori Magoo says the George Bush stuff is a cult. Okay. The anti-Bush people are a cult. Right? David Hassan, right? Because David Hassan came out of the Moonies a little bit later. The Republican president was Trump. Right, and so then Trump became a cult, right? So it says, you want to have a little piece of evidence of that, like the cult of Trump. Hassan, there's no way Hassan is gonna hear about this or anything, but Hassan, cult of Trump, right? Okay, well, Trump endorses the jab, right? Trump is a big fan of the Pfizer mystery juice, and I can say that, right? Because they have a trade secret on that. They don't have to tell you what's in it, but in kind of a soft way, you have to take it, like it's sort of soft mandated, right? But they don't have to tell you what's in it. Trump's a big fan of this. Trump wants you to get the jab. He's saying, "Oh, I took the jab. I think you should get the jab." So, cult of Trump. So all the Trump supporters, they're all lining up to get the jab, right? It's a fucking cult, right? Well, Hassan, if there's a cult of Trump and Trump's telling them to drink the Kool-Aid, why aren't they drinking the Kool-Aid? I'm getting all hot and bothered. So, yeah, so don't try to boomerang any of this back to me. Turn on the TV. You see all the tagged authorities. They all go in one direction. Now, that one direction changes from time to time. Right? One time it was like anti-big business. Now it's turbo pro big business. Right? Now it's like turbo pro, like let Google run everything. Let Google know everything about you. Let Amazon know everything about you. Let Amazon sell you everything. Okay, and let Pfizer inject you with whatever they want, and you have to do it, right? You'll own nothing, be happy, right? I mean, that it's like a corporate dystopia. It is like the worst, the most breathless predictions that, like, Gabriel Kolko would have ever predicted is happening right now, and like you're all in favor of it. It's insane. So the religion that is promoted, it all goes in one direction. Okay, and you talk about Christianity. Okay, Christianity is a vestigial legacy religion. It's basically just like old traditions of a group of people. Like the real culty causey people, they aren't Christians anymore, by and large. I mean, there's a few crazy Christian ladies running around, and they can be annoying. Okay, but that's it. Like, what the heck are Christians gonna do? Take signs in front of your house and say God hates fags or something? Like, I mean, that's annoying. And maybe even for like a person who like a gay who gets killed by a bunch of Christians or something, if that happens from time to time. I forget the name. Like Matthew Shepard, like that wasn't, like he wasn't killed for being gay. That actually had to do with him not paying. Basically, the person who killed him was a drug dealer, and Matthew Shepard wasn't paying him, but that's swept under the rug. And this was before the internet, when they could get away with bigger whoppers than they can now. But anyway, but the thing is, this, raging against Christian bigots, quote unquote, right? It's an exercise in live action role playing. Those are your ancestors, not mine. Like the real hardcore Christian nutters, the crazy Christian ladies, like those are your ancestors, not mine. Okay, like it was people like you that were pushing like this retarded, zombie man rises from the dead, God becomes his son, kills himself, so now you can get into heaven. Right? I mean, it's an insane story. It's ridiculous. And today, like Christians today, they kind of sort of believe it. Maybe they don't believe it. Maybe they just sort of say it's an allegory. Maybe it's something for them to do on Sunday, and meet up with people in the community and go fishing and barbecuing. In fact, I'm pretty sure that's what it mostly is at this point, right? It's not it's not really a cult. Maybe you get it can get a little bit dangerous when they're teaching kids and the kids are taking this stuff way too seriously. But for the most part, it's one of the one of the most harmless cults that most of the time most churches don't even get into the cult stuff. Most of like the real heavy hardcore cult shit that happens at these churches isn't even Christian anyway, right? They're pushing like, if you feel like you should cut off your balls, do it. I mean, this is like, are you guys trying to look like a cult? Like in every cult, there's like castration, right? And I don't know what it is. I'm sure there's some psychological reasoning for it that's like really complicated. I don't know what it is. I just notice a brute correlation between what it is we call cults and castration. And it varies in terms of what percentage of members of a group will actually cut off their balls, but it's always some percentage. And now you're seeing that with the transgender thing. You're seeing guys cut off their balls, right? And then trying to transcend to like to move up the ranks in class, right? Instead of having to be a male where everyone is like kind of rude to you and nobody cares about your feelings, now you get to become a girl, right, where the world is a lot nicer to you. So the thing is, you rage against Christian bigots. It's an exercise in live-action role-playing, and you do it because it's fun. And it's fun because it's safe. And it's safe because they don't have any power. Yes, old-timey Christians were horrible. And the thing is, they were like you. They were hopped up on some cause to save the world and save everyone's eternal soul or whatever. Save the world from global warming. Okay, so now you have the global warming thing, so it's a religious matter on that, which now calls into question all that, because now it's a religious issue. Right? The global warming thing is now a religious issue. Right? Earth's going to turn into Venus. Strange, nobody who's actually sort of at the top promoting this stuff is acting like it's true. Like, there's no mass sell-off of like beachfront property. There's no, like, nobody's acting like any of the big apocalyptic predictions are true on that, but whatever. I don't want to go down that rabbit hole here. So anyway, let's talk about the mechanism by which this happens. For like a real virus, it's going to be roughly this process. So the virus, it's going to make body fall somewhere, and once it gets into your body, it starts infecting cells. The cells, while they're being infected, they release a bunch of cytokines. This is basically a kill me signal, right? And then the cytokines attract these things called phagocytes. Now, the phagocytes are dumb, and basically they come in and gobble up everything in the general vicinity, including your own cells. This tends to slow or even halt the spread of the virus at the expense of damaging your own cells. But in this sort of battle zone, the phagocytes, over millions of encounters, they always leave behind viral remnants. These viral remnants are picked up by dendritic cells. Dendritic cells then, and somehow, I'm not sure about this part, they find their way back to memory T cells, which create antibodies based on the viral remnants. These antibodies, they then stick to the virus or bacteria or whatever the invader is that has that protein structure. Right? The antibodies hook onto that protein structure that they are antibodies for. So say a virus can be divided into 20 discrete parts. For natural immunity that you get from the natural process of the viral remnants being spirited away by dendritic cells, the viral remnants of the viruses that got destroyed by the phagocytes, you have antibodies against the whole of the virus. Because we're dealing with trillions of viruses and trillions of these encounters, for any noticeable infections, you're going to get the whole virus profile. These antibodies then stick to their respective parts of the virus, and then somehow these things called killer T cells are attracted to that and know to kill whatever the antibodies are attached to. Okay, so how does the jab work? Well, what they do is they deliver mRNA into your cells. This mRNA then gets caught up by the ribosomes, right? Sort of the ticker tape readers. The RNA is like the ticker tape, and it goes through the ribosome, which is like the ticker tape reader, that then produces proteins based on the RNA that's going through the ribosome. The RNA in the jabs tells your ribosome to produce the spike protein. Right? See, I don't know if that's related to the CGG dimer, but it's the thing at the end. It's the corona of the coronavirus that hooks into the cells, right? So then you have a whole bunch of spike proteins just floating around your bloodstream. Of course, your cells, which are infected with this vaccine, right, because they're being infected, they release cytokines, right, which then calls in the phagocytes, which also calls in the dendritic cells, which capture a bunch of spike proteins, right? So now you have immunological memory against those things that were being shot out of your cells, but nothing else, okay? Then the memory T cells dutifully produce the necessary antibodies for the spike protein and nothing else. Do you already see the problem? You don't get full immunological memory from the jab. You only get memory of the spike protein because that's all you're exposed to. It seems retarded the way I'm explaining it, so you may be forgiven for thinking I must be leaving something important out, and well, maybe I am. Like, and again, this is a running theme, like the experts, the adults, like the people who have dedicated their entire lives to this, like they couldn't make something this balls in your face dumb. And because those people, they're so smart, they couldn't make something that is as simplistically dumb as I am describing it. So it must not. So what I'm saying must not be true. Well, I have a theory for why they did this and how it's actually not as stupid as it seems at first glance, but ultimately ends up having this result. Now, when people got chickenpox when they were kids, they have immunity well into old age. So sure, the chickenpox virus probably mutates here and there, but it can't mutate entirely. Let's look at this another way. Say you're trying to evolve a virus, right? You want it to go from looking like this to looking like this. How would you go about it? Would you, A, subject it to one selective pressure at a time, and as the virus sample adapts to that pressure, then add another pressure one at a time, or would you, B, apply all 20 selective pressures at once? If you applied them all at once, you would have no viruses left. So obviously, you apply the selective pressures one at a time, right? You don't want to kill off the viruses, so you don't apply all the selective pressures at once. You do it one at a time, and then you get a little bit of a change. You get a new population that's a little bit different. Then round two of selection, right? Kill off perhaps most of them, but then the ones that remain are a little bit different, and you do that over and over and over again until you finally get whatever you want, so long as there's an evolutionary pathway that far. Then when the virus adapted to that, you set up another one-dimensional response, and over and over and over. It's easier to mutate at a single point in the virus than at all points, which is why the human immune system is so horrible for viruses, because it pressures all parts of the virus all at once, so that no single mutation can survive a fully ramped up immune response in principle. In principle. As we know, you still get sick from time to time. So this is obviously a bit of an oversimplification, but evidence that this is generally true is why you spend most of your life being not sick, than being sick, because your immune system wins 99.9999999% of the time. Because so long as the system is working properly, you will win 100% of the time. And the truly deadly viruses that get through it, they do it by compromising the immune system in response in some way, so that what I'm describing here, the immune system process, doesn't actually play out, or gets some sort of wrenches thrown in the works in this process, and so it doesn't actually work effectively. So anyway, all this is to say that by just targeting the spike protein, you're doing exactly what one would do if he was intentionally trying to create new variants. And that is, in fact, what we are seeing playing out empirically. So there you have it. You have this brute coincidental evidence that, yes, the vaccine-resistant viruses are caused by the vaccines. What part of the virus is being mutated that causes them to be so dangerous? It's the spike protein, which is exactly what these mRNA injections are doing. They're making your cells produce a bunch of the spike protein. And at what part of the virus are they changing? Like, what is the relevant mutation of the Delta variant that has made it, dangerous? Well, it's a different spike protein. Okay? So, and we know the mechanism by which this could happen. So, but again, the way a traditional vaccine works is that a person is injected with either a live virus or a virus which has had its DNA or RNA removed. So it hooks into the cells, causing the cells to release cytokines, and the whole process plays out with the phagocytes coming in, viral remnants, dendritic cells, memory T cells, antibodies. The whole process is carries out, but there's never any real threat because the viruses themselves have been sterilized and don't replicate. Assuming that the viruses actually have all been sterilized, which may not always be true depending on the manufacturing process, but and with that you get something very similar to natural immunity from a traditional vaccine. That's how traditional vaccines work in principle. So to say, other vaccines, they seem to work fine, what's the deal with this? Why are you so against this? Traditional egg-based vaccines have all worked just fine. Why do you have a problem with this mRNA, quote-unquote, vaccine, right? They're not the same, so that's a false comparison. They both get stuck into you by a needle, by a nurse with gloves, but their mechanism is entirely different. And so, as you go down this line of reasoning of, well, other vaxes seem to have worked, go back to 2018. Now you see potentially a reason for anti-vaxxer, right? For like the authority blitz anti-vaxxer before COVID. And when something this obvious is pointed out to you by me or by anyone else who's saying this stuff, then it's to that other hook. This seems far too simple. This seems far too simple, right? Now, here is where I get a little bit hypothetical. Obviously, this next bit is not something you'll even consider if you still don't think that the injection-resistant variants are caused by the injections, right? If you still think like, it's the unvaccinated, it's these people that are causing the variants. Like, if you still think that, then nothing I say going forward is going to matter to you. But I think that the spike protein was targeted in the vaccine, quote-unquote, because the virologists involved in engineering the virus didn't think the spike protein could mutate. So, let me back up. This is my thought process. 1, we know the virus was engineered. We've been over that. That's not speculation. We're not relitigating that. 2, these vaccines were created very quickly. Suspiciously quickly to me, but what is suspicious is just like my opinion, man. Maybe I don't know enough to be suspicious about anything. Fair enough. I think this is too short of a development time, but what do I know? 3, the rapid development was foreordained. Operation Warp Speed, right? There was a whole propaganda suite already in place to foreordain the unprecedented speed at which this quote-unquote vaccine would come about. Okay, so not only was it, I think, the fastest developed vaccine in history, but this unprecedentedly fast development was foreordained. The rapid distribution of this quote-unquote vaccine was getting prepared for years in advance by the World Health Organization. And in September of 2019, through Trump's vaccine task force that was specifically trying to move away from traditional egg-based vaccines, right, which we just talked about, which are, frankly, what do I know? But it seems like the egg-based vaccines are just like real vaccines versus the mRNA insanity, like scam. But that was being set up through Trump's vaccine task force. 5. The gain-of-function research was targeted at manipulating the spike protein in particular. In fact, it seems that all of this operation was about manipulating the spike protein, right? Both in North Carolina and in Wuhan. It was about modifying the spike protein to make it more optimized to infect humans. Meaning that it took a great deal of effort to manipulate the spike protein of the coronavirus. Thus, in the virology labs, it seemed that the spike protein could never be expected to mutate on its own, given how difficult it was for them to mutate it in a laboratory setting. And 6, the vaccine causes your cells to produce the spike protein to create antibodies against the spike protein. Now, having laid this out, can you predict what I'm going to say next? I think the quote-unquote vaccine development and the virus development occurred concurrently. And the companies which made the vaccine, quote-unquote, based on their experience, concluded that the spike protein couldn't mutate on its own. For this reason, a vaccine that generated antibodies just against the spike protein and nothing else would work because the spike protein couldn't mutate. A conclusion they came to due to their experience while engineering the virus. So this is wildly hypothetical. I know. But if my explanation of the vaccine was generally correct, that it is this spike protein factory, that it just causes your cells to produce the spike protein, well, now we need an explanation as to why the drug companies would push a quote-unquote vaccine that is this incredibly stupid. And my explanation is that the drug companies didn't think the spike protein could mutate on its own. Why would they think this? Because they engineered the virus in the first place. That's why they would come to such a radical conclusion that they thought they had good evidence for, ended up being wrong, as we now know. And this also explains why they were able to get the vaccine, quote-unquote, out so fast, and why the rapid deployment of this vaccine was foreordained, because I think they had been working on the vaccine well before, even September of 2019. Before even the vaccine task force came about, I think, these companies were working on the vaccine, what is called the vaccine. There's a scene in Jurassic Park where the math guy is saying, right, to not mess around with nature.
It's not possible. Listen, if there's one thing the history of evolution has taught us, it's that life will not be contained. Life breaks free, it expands to new territories, and it crashes through barriers painfully, maybe even dangerously, but, there it is. There it is.
You're implying that a group composed entirely of female animals will breed?
No, I'm simply saying that life finds a way.
Like, the moral of the story of Jurassic Park is, like, very, very conservative, like, in the original sense. It's caution. Have caution. The moral of the story is basically almost like a cautionary tale against scientific hubris. And that's kind of what was running through my head when I saw all these people just throwing themselves onto these needles. Like, a new needle thing is out. Hop on. The absolute faith in the FDA and pharma companies, and just a wild lack of caution. It's just crazy risky. But I guess they don't see the risk because they have so much faith. I envision some guy in Wuhan or North Carolina saying, "Are you sure the spike protein can't mutate?" And then his fellow researchers demand a specific explanation for how it could possibly mutate. They've run all the tests, you see, but somehow life found a way. Well, depending on whether you consider a virus to be alive, I mean, I guess you could say something like, instead of life finds a way, you could say something like, entities that replicate imperfectly so as to create pseudo-random diversity is a kind of meta-adaptation that has allowed it to survive a range of selective pressures that you can't possibly imagine, and thus it is the height of hubris if you think that you have found the one selective pressure that it cannot get around, right? So that would be like the cautionary line against, you know, let's have a vaccine against the corona of the coronavirus and nothing else. But that's obviously a lot less poetic than life finds a way, right? So I don't know if this is what happened, but this explains. I admit it is a just so story. Just because a story fits what you think are all of the important facts doesn't make it true. So I'm not totally committed to this explanation, but I'll just put it in storage as consideration for what happened. All right, now let's look at death numbers. So how many people died of COVID? So the first problem is that hospitals are being paid to report COVID patients. So I went around in the wild saying this and was surprised to find that there's a strange denial of this. That there's a strange denial that doctors are being paid to report COVID. Like, did you know that? Did you know that there are people denying this? So, okay, let's read the CARES Act. And I'm going to read the relevant passage. If you think, you can read the whole thing yourself. It's publicly available. In fact, I'll link it for you. So you don't even have to search CARES Act or whatever. So here's what I consider the relevant passage. Quote, for discharges occurring during the emergency period described in section 1135G1B, in the case of a discharge of an individual diagnosed with COVID-19, the Secretary shall increase the weighting factor that would otherwise apply to the diagnosis-related group to which the discharge is assigned by 20%. Okay, so discharge is government money. The Secretary shall identify a discharge of such an individual through the use of diagnosis codes, condition codes, or other such means as may be necessary. So there you go. And there's all manner of individual doctors reporting that they put COVID on the death certificate because hospitals want more money, right? Be they government hospitals or quote-unquote private hospital, they still get money from Medicare. So believe it or not, factcheck.org, of all places, confirms this. I was shocked that even they would admit this, but they did. And of course, it wasn't until halfway through their post, right, which was mostly, they were just shitting on a bunch of literally who's, you know, who posted YouTube videos saying what factcheck.org is saying are false claims. I don't know. I don't care. Halfway through their post, they finally get to the point, right? They finally get to the relevant thing that was in their headline about government paying money to write COVID on the death certificate, where they say, this is from factcheck.org, they say, quote, it is true, however, that the government will pay more for hospitalizations for COVID-19 cases in two senses. By paying an additional 20% on top of traditional Medicare rates for COVID-19 patients during the public health emergency, and by reimbursing hospitals for treating the uninsured patients with the disease at that enhanced Medicare rate. So that second part I didn't even know. Factcheck.org just added something that I didn't even know. They made the case better than I did. Both of those provisions stems from the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or CARES Act. The CARES Act created the 20% add-on to be paid for Medicare patients with COVID-19. The act further created a $100 billion fund that is being used to financially assist hospitals, a portion of which will be used to reimburse healthcare providers at Medicare rates for COVID-related treatment of the uninsured, according to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Okay, done. Factcheck.org then goes to spin their wheels and obfuscate and ink cloud and just games, but that there. Okay, thank you, fact check. You answered the issue on whether the government is paying doctors to write COVID on the death certificates, and the answer is yes. There, okay, done, right? And no more and you don't need to obfuscate or lie beyond that. Just accept what you yourself said. So Medicare is paying hospitals to report COVID deaths. Doesn't matter how you phrase it, or what you say the money is supposed to be for. The fact is that if a doctor writes COVID on the death card, the hospital, and in all likelihood the doctor himself to some degree, gets more money. This is true. I personally think that was the intention of the CARES Act, but whether it was intentional or not is irrelevant, because at the end of the day, doctors get paid more for writing COVID on the death certificate. If I gave you a bag of marbles, and I trusted you to tell me what color the marbles were, and would pay you $10 for every marble, except for green marbles, I would pay you $12 for every green marble that was in there. And you tell me the color of the marbles. Would you overstate the number of green marbles? Maybe you would, maybe you wouldn't. But you can see the problem. In this kind of sterilized example, it would be easier to be honest because, like, it's just you and it's just $2. And maybe a doctor would be honest in this situation, or maybe he wouldn't be honest in this sort of counting marbles example. But if you're running a hospital and you see shortages every day, and you see patients suffering or even dying because of these shortages, I don't think, the right thing to do would be so clear-cut. And on top of that, there may be some gray areas, the ultimate cause of death of this person. So why not write COVID? Who gets hurt if we write COVID on this death card? Who gets hurt if we don't? So really the question becomes, how inflated do you think the COVID death numbers are? The idea that they're not inflated at all is ridiculous given the incentives and the needs of the hospitals. So the total number of COVID deaths in the United States are inherently suspect. We don't know what the multiplier is for real versus false COVID deaths. The cause of death for all these people is essentially a black box. We know what the doctors say, and in the absence of any motivation to lie, sure, trusting the doctor's diagnosis seems perfectly acceptable. But because there is a motivation to lie, which I'm not saying is immoral on their part, I think I've made that very clear, but since there is a motivation to lie, and since, what am I going to do? Go to every hospital in the U.S. and personally check every single death report and then do an autopsy on all these decaying corpses? No, it's incumbent upon those who claim the COVID death numbers are accurate to evidence that in some way. And when the government is paying doctors to write COVID on the death cards, like, I'm sorry, that's not, you can't use that. You can't pay somebody to say something and then use that as evidence that that thing's happening. Okay, whereas previously there would be no need for proof of cause of death other than a doctor's word, because there was no systemic reason to distrust doctors. Now there is. Therefore, the overall claimed COVID death numbers in the United States should be rejected outright, and thus we are limited to inferential modes of estimating COVID deaths, which, as you'll see, I don't even bother. Overall deaths is all that matters, and overall deaths is inherently complete, right? Because whatever negative effects there are of the jab versus whatever positive effects those are going to play out in the mortality numbers. So even though you don't know discretely, like, mechanism and things like that, you know the overall end result, right? You know the final, right? So it is inherently complete even if you can't see under the hood. death number. Death is an inherently complete statistic, even if you can't disentangle the components. So, on a related topic, the numbers of vax versus unvax deaths are also suspicious because of how the CDC counts vaccinated and unvaccinated. Quote, this is from the CDC themselves, quote, persons were considered fully vaccinated with greater than or equal to 14 days after receipt of the second dose in a 2-dose series of Pfizer, BioNTech, or Moderna COVID-19 vaccines, or after 1 dose of the single-dose Johnson & Johnson COVID-19 vaccine. They're considered partially vaccinated if greater than or equal to 14 days after receipt of the first dose and less than 14 days after the second dose in a 2-dose series. And unvaccinated less than 14 days after this receipt of a 2-dose series or 1 dose of the single-dose vaccine if no CARE 2 vaccination data were available. COVID-19 associated hospitalizations were defined as hospital administrations occurring less than or equal to 14 days after a first SARS-CoV-2 infection. COVID-19 associated deaths were defined as deaths occurring less than or equal to 60 days after the date of a first laboratory confirmed SARS-CoV-2 infection or deaths with COVID-19 listed as a cause of or contributing condition to death. So this is a problem because when real people in the real world are making the decision to get the jab, there is pre-jab and there is post-jab. This 14 days crap, I'm sure there's some very good epidemiological reasons for that time delay in sort of your thought process. Fine, whatever. But for a real person, they don't get to just skip those 14 days. Those 14 days are part of getting jabbed. That 14-day window where you don't consider them vaccinated may have some epidemiological truth to it. But when talking about vaccinated versus unvaccinated deaths, if 50% of people died immediately after getting jabbed, what? Would you just say, oh, everyone who died was unvaccinated? Like, you could say that and that would be true. Like, I mean, or you could have something where everyone dies immediately after getting the jab. You could say that. Everyone who gets the jab immediately drops dead right there on the spot. With that, if that were the case, would the CDC say they were unvaccinated? So everyone who has died is unvaccinated. Like, that would literally be true because it's within the 14-day window. Another problem is that, like, say you get jabbed at a pharmacy. You won't count as vaccinated unless you send that information to your physician. This is from Mercola. Quote, to actually count as a confirmed vaccinated individual, you must send your vaccination card to your primary care physician's office and have them add it to your electronic medical record. If you get a shot at a pharmacy, you'll need to verify that they forwarded your proof of vaccination to your doctor. Primary care offices are then responsible for sharing their patients' immunization data with the state's immunization information system. Patient-recorded proof of vaccination is only accepted for influenza and pneumococcal vaccines, not COVID-19 injections. What all this means is that, say you get the shot several weeks ago at a drive-through vaccination clinic and get admitted to the hospital with COVID symptoms. Unless your COVID shot status has actually been added into the medical system, you will not count as vaccinated. Okay, so how many of these people who get jabbed and then die of something, which then gets tagged as a COVID death, is recorded as not jabbed? So that's another problem. Who's getting counted as vaccinated and not? So to be vaccinated, you must have been jabbed 14 days ago, depending on the brand, and this must be recorded in the medical system, whatever that is. If you just have a card saying you were, that won't be accepted for COVID. It's accepted for other things, despite being accepted for influenza and pneumococcal vaccines, but it's not accepted for COVID. So there's that special difference there. So having dealt with problems with the death numbers, how can we infer actual deaths by this virus and by the jab? I have no idea, but I did find an interesting study. I call it a study, but it's really an analysis. It's from Spiro Pantazatos and Herv Seligman. Spiro has under here Columbia University. Ultimately, we need to break the value of these authority tags and get to a kind of prediction market or some metric way of validating experts. But at the moment, the fact that he's from Columbia University is situationally useful in that maybe you'll be more likely to listen to what he's saying, even though ultimately that kind of thing, that kind of authority thing, needs to be abolished and replaced with something better. So one of the things he was able to do was track all-cause mortality by time frame and age group in the United States and a selection of European countries. And this is what he found. Now, on the whole, over the 30-week window they looked at, the gross overall effect was positive. The yellow area is more death. The blue area is less death. So older people, 65 to 74 and 75 to 84, they died more right after getting the jab, but then benefited for a while until having their mortality go back up to slightly higher than the general population. So I'm looking at this, and I'm looking here, 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 and here, and that's my problem. This pattern is exactly what would be predicted if those general criticisms from guys like Robert Malone of these mRNA jabs were true. That they're creating a hyper-focused immunity that weakens general immunity in the long term, and it is going to inevitably wane and is just going to breed more variants. Right? And also the CDC is not counting people for the first 2 weeks, i.e. they're not counting this, or this. In his paper, using a bunch of inferential methods, one of which I think is more easily understandable, they estimated the VAERS multiplier. VAERS, as I'm sure you all know, is the Adverse Vaccine Reaction Reporting Service in the U.S. Now, unbelievably, there have been shitlib posts saying VAERS underreports. I was completely flabbergasted at how anyone's mind could even go there. So, I relentlessly rip on academics, but holy crap, the stuff on VAERS, this is a situation where academics are far more level-headed about VAERS than, the plebit types. I mean, you can find VAERS reports that are obviously fake and ridiculous, but, are you saying that's what these are? Or that it's just it's systemically people who get stomach aches and then go to the doctor who then reports it into VAERS? Anyway, these guys estimate the VAERS multiplier to be about 20 times in terms of death. So for every VAERS death report, there are 19 more real deaths caused by the injection that are unreported. Now, if some VAERS are obvious hoaxes or whatever, fine. If you think half of the VAERS report are either fake or hypochondriacs or anything, which I think is ludicrous, but say you think half of them are fake or illegitimate somehow. Okay, then that just means that legitimate VAERS reports underreport real deaths by a factor of 40. So it's kind of a moot point. If half of the reports are fake, then that just increases the multiplier for the real ones, because we know how many people are dying after they get jabbed. Bizarrely, I've heard these proven and effective treatments get labeled alternative treatments, like ivermectin is alternative, while this thing that the kind of medical political nexus is shoving on us is what? Mainstream? So I think that's it. I think I've said my piece about the whole COVID program and what I think it is. We can speculate about motivations, but I'm losing personal interest on this stuff. It's obviously just a con, so I find it hard to personally care about anything beyond that. My interest in this sort of only goes as here's an example of the big authority, right? Big authority nexus, science TM, full press, and just wrong. None of these things that they're pushing are at all effective. They're just wrong down the line. And that's what's of interest to me. And also just seeing kind of like how comprehensive the scam is, right? The run-up, for example. And, you know, and establishing the response to the virus 3 months before the virus gets released. And the denial that it came from a lab, despite ridiculously overwhelming evidence that it came from a lab, but just the continued denial and the continued just authority pounding, right? The Lancet statement, just pounding that authority over and over and over again. You know, and even fact checkers, factcheck.org, to their credit, in the middle of their thing, admits that yes, government is paying doctors to write COVID on the death certificates. You know, but they still spend most of the article talking about some guy's YouTube video where he supposedly said something wrong. Maybe, maybe not. Who knows? Who cares? It's become a great bugaboo. It's, without a doubt, the most aggressively pushed vaccine in history. Its delivery method is completely wild. And just remember Occupy Wall Street, when all of the culty-causey people, when all those types of people were all hating on big business. And now, like, they literally want everyone forced to inject corporate juice for a virus that these firms were probably involved in making, which is not an extraordinary claim, right? You may see that as like, oh, that's beyond the pale. That's like beyond comprehension. That's something like that could happen. Like, why? Like, look at how long it took for it to come out that, yeah, this virus was created in a lab. Look at how long that took to come out. Look at how much resistance, just how much institutional authoritative resistance there was just in the denial that it came from a lab. And how even that's not completely gone. I think the Wiki article still has, you know, massive denial of this. They're still in overwhelming denial of the lab origins. And so yeah, they're going to be in even greater denial that the people, right, in whatever organization, you know, company, government agency, secret government agency, clandestine, whatever, you know, roof or whatever, like, label that they operate under, doesn't matter, right? If the people involved in engineering the virus were also involved in engineering the vaccine for it, like, the amount of authority resistance to that is just going to be, like, it's going to be like nothing other. Like, if that were true, that may be something that they will never crack on, at least not for like 100 years, at which point it doesn't matter anymore, so they can admit it. But the thing is, that's like an extraordinary claim. But I mean, there's all these secret documents, right? Like, you call me like you know, the loony conspiracy guy or whatever, but like, I mean, do we have access to like everything that's at Pfizer? Do we have access to everything that's at the NIH? Like, you don't know. You can't say decisively that, you know, this is not the case. And I've laid out, you know, a lot of, you know, admittedly it's a just so story and it's kind of connect the dots. Fine, fair enough. I haven't heard anything compelling otherwise that explains the rapid rollout of the jab, the seemingly stupid design of it, the whole spike protein factory thing, the campaign to deny the lab origins, right? It's just, again, you know, you're seeing what, like, conspiracy theorist, quote unquote, looks like. And the thing is, this is not something that I was like told by anyone else. Like, this is stuff like I'm looking at, wow, that's a really stupid jab design. Wow, that's a very rapid development of this vaccine. Wow, they got stuff in place to prepare for a pandemic 3 months before the surprise pandemic comes out. Wow, they're going hardcore denying the lab origins. And then we find out basically, yeah, lab origins. I mean, like, if it was a comprehensive con, if it was a if Plandemic was true, like that explains all of it. I get it. Explanation is not proof. Anyone can tell a story that fits. I get that. Like, what else? Like, what else is there? If this were true, what else would we see? Like, just think about it. Like, the idea of comprehensive Plandemic, are there people with the means to do this? Yes. Yes, if the FDA is co-opted, if the CDC is co-opted, Fauci is definitely co-opted because he was funding gain-of-function research clandestinely, right, against congressional bans against such a thing. So Fauci was in on something, right? So the NIH is compromised. The FDA is compromised. Is the CDC compromised? Looks like it. The kind of stunts that they're pulling in terms of how they're counting COVID deaths, right? Looks like they're compromised. Pfizer's a corporation, so by definition they're compromised. You know, the news outlets, the big six, I mean, they're just spokesholes. They're clueless. So are they they might be actually compromised, or they might just be idiots that parrot, what the corporate adults say. So means, yeah, check, means. The idea that a group of people, around in the FDA, in Pfizer and Janssen and Janssen and Moderna, the idea that these people could do this is not something that can just be ruled out. It looks like they have the means to do that. Okay, so check, means. Motive. All sorts of motives. For the company side, piles and piles of cash for this jab. So money, that's a motive right there. Anyone trying to expand, government powers for things that they just want more sinecures. They want to use this to advance something else. We've heard about like the Great Reset thing. And you might not take that seriously. Okay, the thing is, these kinds of things are generally not taken seriously until they're out, right? Like Event 201 and all these like orgs, all these like the Rockefeller Foundation running all these simulations on like pandemics and stuff, right? No one's taking it seriously until bam, here it is. Like, and so they're talking about Great Reset. You will owe nothing and you will be happy. Okay, so motive for all the stuff, check. A series of strange coincidences that can be best explained by both the virus and the vaccine being part of a singular program from the start, the COVID program from the start. Oh, check. There are a series of strange coincidences that, as far as I can tell, can best be explained by both the virus and the vaccine being part of a singular comprehensive program. And like I say this, and like there's just a wall of incredulity to this. Like, you're just crazy, man, for saying this. But then it's just you're crazy. It's just you're crazy. But like there's no substance against anything I'm saying. It's just the kinds of authority plays that said, oh, PCR tests work. Oh, masks work. Oh, the vaccine works. It's a vaccine and it works. Right? These are all, right? It's the same kind of just, I don't know, like thoughtless, authority emotion, like the system wouldn't let this happen. It has to be more, right? What you're talking about is too wild, it's too crazy. It would really be too, reality is more mundane than what I'm saying. But look, we already have crossed one Rubicon, right? That the NIH was clandestinely funding gain-of-function research, i.e. viral bioweapons, and they were funding it in China. Okay, so we've already crossed a pretty big Rubicon there, and that they were lying about it. So we've already crossed several Rubicons, right? Vaccine passports, that was supposed to be a conspiracy theory. Here it is, right? It's limited in its effect in the United States, but right, the people in all these institutions would love to be like Australia. So so we've already crossed a whole bunch of Rubicons. A lot of things that were 2 years ago were unthinkable are like right here, are like right in your face. So and now, like, I guess what I'm saying, that the whole thing was a singular comprehensive program from the start. Let me ask you this: is the things that happened from 2019 to now, right? There's that gap. There's a whole bunch of things that people in like the middle of 2019, if they told you that these things were going to happen, you would call them crazy, you would call them a conspiracy theorist, and yet they happened. Okay, so there's that gap of things that actually happened, proven, right? Lockdowns happened, vaccine that doesn't work happened, okay? Fake tests happened, stupid masks that don't work mandate happened, okay? Vaccine passports happened, all right? Camps for the unvaccinated happened, right? All that in some countries, not in the U.S., but in some countries, it happened, okay? So there's all sorts of crazy things that did, in fact, happen, right? And so there's that gap from 2019 to today of crazy stuff that has, in fact, happened and has, in fact, been orchestrated from, sort of the top, the milieu of the top, right? Government agencies and corporations and the news houses working to make these crazy things happen. Okay, so there's that gap. Then there's the gap from what actually has happened to me saying it was a singular program, that the virus and the quote-unquote vaccine were engineered concurrently. There's that gap. How big is that gap? How big is the gap between what has actually happened, what has actually been shown to be the case, that the virus was engineered, okay, and it was engineered in cooperation with some elements of the Chinese government at the very least, between that and what I'm saying is that it was all a singular program from the start. I don't think that gap is very big. I don't think what I'm saying is that much of a leap. We already have, the virus was engineered, and a lot of the people that are involved in the FDA are from these pharma companies that engineered the vaccine. How much crossover is there between people who worked on engineering the virus who also worked on engineering the vaccine? Right? How much crossover is there? I don't know. But it doesn't seem that far-fetched. Fauci was working with the pharma companies on this before it was happening. Right? Fauci was talking to was in a public press conference. He was talking about how he's trying to get the pharma companies on board with pushing for this mRNA stuff, right? To move away from the traditional egg vaccines into some mRNA stuff, and that the vaccine manufacturers were a little bit hesitant about this because it's something new, it's risky, and all that stuff, right? And he was saying it's the responsibility of the government to help move that along, right? So we know that Fauci himself is involved in the NIH and in gain-of-function research. He knows about it beforehand. He was funding it, and he was funding it in China. So we know that. we know that Fauci was also trying to get pharma companies to do mRNA vaccine stuff, right? So we're sort of working our way towards a comprehensive op somehow. So what am I? Am I just crazy conspiracy man? Am I seeing patterns in noise that don't represent anything? They're just kind of weird coincidences that are just part of reality, and I'm just making connections that are non-causal, that aren't real, that are just kind of curious coincidences. Because curious coincidences happen, but, you know, it's a big world out there. With so many events, you're bound to have things that look weird from time to time. But, you know, just like if you take a series of random numbers, every once in a while you'll get, you know, with enough numbers from a random number generator, eventually you'll get pi out to 20 digits. And that seems kind of weird, but that can happen randomly. It doesn't mean anything. So maybe that's what I'm falling for. I'm seeing a weird pattern that doesn't mean anything. Right? That could be the case. But I'm sort of talking in circles here, and I don't have that much else to say, so I have to end the video somewhere. So I'll end the video